All right, welcome back to another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. I'm your host, Omar Zaran, and thank you, as always, for joining me on another episode of the podcast. This week, the timeliness of this episode, I think, is incredibly important. This week, I'm joined for an interview with Doug Villhard. Doug is a university professor in St. Louis, but he's also a author. And he recently published a book about the great Red Grange, one of the first Hall of Famers in the NFL's history. This is a book that chronicles the collegiate and professional career of Red Grange, but also has a lot of commentary about Red the player, the personality, the world of college football, paying players, its relationship with the NFL, and the relationship with agents. So it touches on a lot of things that are topical right now. NIL is in the news. If you heard a previous episode from a week or two ago, we were talking about that. Also, just the way that we look at professional football and collegiate football and the differences there. So it's incredibly timely. And it's also timely because coming up on October 19th, Michigan and Illinois will be playing in the 100-year anniversary of the game where Red Grange scored 4 touchdowns for Illinois against Michigan. So that is kind of why Doug has put out this book at this time and why it is incredibly important to discuss it right now. So my conversation with Doug is coming up next, where we cover the book, CC Pyle, the agent in the book, Red Grange, his career, and a lot of the parallels that we see from the game 100 years ago in 1925 all the way up to this year in 2024 going into 2025. So it's a great conversation with Doug Villhard, the author of The Golden Age of Red, a historical look at Red Grange. So stay tuned after the break and we will get into our conversation with Doug. All right, joining me now on the Deep Cover podcast is author Doug Villhard. He's author of a book called Golden Age of Red, a novel chronicling NFL and college football great Red Grange. So, Doug, thank you so much for making some time to talk on the podcast today.
Yeah, my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, like I was mentioning before we started, I just read your book and I was just really fascinated by it. And I guess my initial thought is, a lot of people write sports books, a lot of people write sports novels. What kind of drew you to want to write a book about Red Grange?
Yeah, so first of all, I do love Red. I absolutely love Red. I and ESPN and many others consider him to be the greatest college football player of all time. Mm-hmm. And the 100-year anniversary of his biggest game is coming up here, yep. Illinois against Michigan. So that was timely too. But if I'm being honest, what actually drew me to it is I'm an entrepreneurship professor at Washington University in St. Louis. So I'm a business professor. Red Grange also hooked up with what's considered to be America's first sports agent. His name is CC Pyle. So it was honestly kind of the business side of it that attracted me. And some of the struggles that Red and CC Pyle were going through are very similar to the NIL debates today, name, image, likeness debates, except back then they just called it fame. Who owns your fame, right?
Yeah.
But it was actually the sports agent that drew me to it.
Yeah, and the whole characterization of Pyle I find to be really interesting because at times, you consider the era was in the 1920s. It kind of feels like a classic 1920s grifter in a weird way, right? It's like, I got this next big thing going on, and ice hockey's the next big thing or whatever. So, do you see his kind of story arc, what he was, kind of really as translated into what representation of athletes has kind of become, where you kind of work through the agent and before you get to the athlete?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think when I think of CC Pyle, they call him America's first sports agent. And by the way, he did such a good job. He was so powerful. This is 1925. Sports agents are banned until the 1960s. because of the success that he had, and we can talk about that. But though he is considered the first sports agent, I think of him more like a promoter, like Don King, who did all of the Tyson fights and everything. And there's parts where that made me excited about the story was Red Grange is a star who does not want to be a star. He never wanted the limelight. He just wanted to be behind the scenes. And then you've got this behind the scenes agent who should be behind the scenes, but he would actually rather be out front and be the star. So that was that the dichotomy between the two of them really drew me to the project as well.
Now, speaking on you kind of prefaced this in the beginning, and I listened to your audiobook on Audible, and you kind of preface like, hey, this is a work of historical fiction, not so much a full-on nonfiction type title. So is the time past a big reason for that, or was there a certain reason why you went historical fiction as opposed to like a more of a nonfiction type style?
Yeah, no, great question. And you're exactly right, historical fiction. I call it biographical historical fiction. It follows the real life facts of Red Grange. But I think it's more fun. I think it's more fun to do it like this. It's basically like you are reading a book, but it's basically like watching the movie. So when the agent, CC Pyle and Red are alone and they're strategizing, well, I wasn't there. Nobody was there except for them. But I'm able to take what happened afterwards and convert it back into what that conversation might be like. And I just think that's fun for a modern audience to get into it that way. And I read a lot of books and a lot of nonfiction books and a lot of sports books. No offense to all the sports books. They're a lot about like stats and what happened and what the weather was like. And so it's like the what. But I wanted to really get into the why, if you will, and put you in that moment. So that's why I like to do it like this.
Yeah, and I found that especially true when you were talking about Red's relationship with, I think her name was Polly. Mm-hmm. And, there's kind of like more of an intimate novel like aspect there, right? Where it kind of makes it a little bit more humanized. Because I agree, I read a lot of sports books as well. There's kind of like, yeah, he came up and did this, then he did that, then he did that. Whereas this is kind of there's story arcs for each of these people throughout the book. Even though it's centered around Red, all these other little characters kind of pop up in there.
Yeah, and I think the idea was, what if you were given this gift and you never wanted it? Right. So if we could get kind of inside his mind a little bit, it makes the story more fun.
And speaking of that, he kind of had this, as you illustrate, a celebrity cult-like status in a weird way, especially when he was in college at Illinois.
Yeah.
And, he would go into places and people would know who he is, which again is why the relationship with Polly was so interesting, because she didn't really know who he was.
Right.
And so thinking about that now, I mean, do you see any parallels to modern college athletes? Has there been a college athlete in recent memory who has reached that level of celebrity status, or is it just not really as big of a thing anymore?
Yeah, so we don't know as much about Red Grange as I feel like we should, right? Which is why I wrote the book. But the main reason is because we didn't have television yet at the time. So most of our athletes that we know today sort of started, especially NFL, started from the television age going forward. The rest are just like lore, old tales, if you will. But others can be seen. But I think that the closest parallel today, actually a very good parallel today, is Caitlin Clark at the University of Iowa. So let's compare contrast. So when Caitlin was a college student, she was incredibly famous, right? Selling out stadiums, and of course she had name, image, likeness opportunities, right, to actually earn money. By the way, not only did Red not earn money until he went pro, he had to pay tuition. They didn't have college scholarships. Yeah. So, but let's go back. Caitlin Clark, very famous in college, and then she joins the WNBA, which of course existed, but I think we could both argue she has elevated that to a different level while she was there. And actually, attendance and ratings went down when she got knocked out of the playoffs, too. So she made a real impact on that league. The exact same thing was true with Red Grange. In fact, more famous than Babe Ruth as a college player. And the pros for like the Chicago Bears, for example. So Illinois is drawing 70,000 fans and Ohio State 85,000 fans, and the Bears are drawing 3,000 fans. Okay, at that time. So when Red joins the NFL, all of a sudden stadiums start selling out. So it was, and they have been teetering on bankruptcy forever and losing teams. Like they ever have a team in week 1 and then they go bankrupt in week 2. You never knew who you were playing. It wasn't consistent. So he really put that league on the map. I think the same way that Caitlin Clark is doing it today.
Yeah, and that's a great point. A lot of people, I think, with Caitlin, they kind of make the Michael Jordan analogy. I've heard that one many times, and to a certain extent, that's true. But when you consider where the WNBA has been, really since its inception in the late '90s to what it is now, it hasn't reached the heights since this past draft class. Obviously, Caitlin Clark being the banner athlete of that, right? And it's kind of like a lot of people are saying, oh, she is going to take a pay cut going from college to pro. And if NIL was around back in the 20s, one would argue the same thing would have been the case for Red Grange.
Yeah. Except, that let's go back to that sports agent again. Mm-hmm. So the Bears were willing to pay players about $50 a game. And they said, you know what, Red, we'll pay you $500 a game. And I think 22-year-old Red would have been like, unbelievable. I'll take it. But CC Pyle was like, well, you know what, that's a good place to start. But instead of $500 a game, how about half the gate? Because you draw 3,000, Red's going to bring 60,000. Let's split it. So now we have Red Grange actually making more money in that game in New York. One game made more money than Babe Ruth made all year, right? So that's the thing about CC Pyle, this huckster promoter, all of this. His argument is that he's a champion for the student athlete, if you will, and he's saying, look, you're being exploited. You're selling out these stadiums for nothing. In fact, you're paying tuition. You have the right to do this. So that was his argument at the time.
And it's interesting, right? Because you look at even in modern days where a lot of times the way things are spun by when delivered to fans, it becomes a situation where they're like, hey, well, the evil player and his agent just want to ask for more money, and the NFL Players Union, for example, is always kind of demonized as this incompetent kind of entity, and everybody is just so protective of defending the league. When you consider like a transcendent type player that comes in, they're going to increase revenue, and you should be on the player's side because you're ultimately there to see the player, right? If the players are no good, you probably wouldn't be watching. I always found that was an interesting dynamic where, a lot of people will be pro-worker in a lot of ways, but in professional athletics, it seems to be not the case. And you could argue that CC Pyle saw the business of it and say, hey, look, they went from 3,000 to however many thousand that when you got here, why should you only be getting $500? You should be getting a bigger cut of that.
Yeah, and especially then, because one, Red's paying tuition, and two, this is a sport where everyone is trying to kill him. They are trying to knock him out of the game. By the way, remember the rules were different there too. Not only did you play both sides of the ball, but if you came out in a half, you couldn't go back in. Again, it's developed off of soccer and professional soccer. Once you come out, you can't go back. Again, it's a test of endurance. So not only do we have all the things that we're talking about, Ohio State has only one goal: try to knock him out of the game, because then he can't come back in. Again, there's no substitution like there is today. There's no concussion tent. I'm not saying there shouldn't be these things, but there weren't. There weren't.
It just didn't exist.
So it's fascinating.
And so I want to pivot to his coach in college, which is Robert Zupke.
Yeah.
And one thing I enjoyed about the audiobook was the accent that was employed there.
Yeah, German, very German. Yeah.
Yeah, very German guy, which in that era, kind of interesting, post-World War I, pre-World War II.
Yeah, he's born in Berlin, yeah.
Yeah, kind of super interesting, but he kind of positions himself as the guard of college football, and there's really a demonization of the NFL in that regard. Not too dissimilar from a demonization that I've seen the NBA do with college basketball over the years, where they kind of distance themselves. So it seems to be that even from the 20s, there was kind of a fraught relationship between the two leagues. And do you think that that's kind of stayed the course and
Oh,
is was kind of like Red Grange, kind of one of the last great like I'm gonna be great in college. I'm the real image of college football type thing, and has the relationship between college and the NFL really improved since then, or is it really more much of the same?
so what they were worried about at the time, Bob Zupke, who, by the way, a great coach. Well, I'd love to talk more maybe in a moment about
Yeah.
some of the things he invented too. Unbelievable coach. Does not get enough credit. But what Zupke is worried about is that, first of all, this game was created in colleges, right? These are the, this at this point it's about 30, 40 years old, right? It started out with what we used to call in my neighborhood kill the man with the ball, which is like throw a ball out and see how far you can take it, right? And then this sport got civilized, if you will.
Yeah.
But he considers it to be a college invention. And he also considers it then to be a great way to create pride amongst colleges and to drive revenue for other sports. So, and a great testament to young men and all these other things that it can be. But what he sees NFL is a threat to, if a college kid has a good game on a Saturday, they just quit college and get recruited the very next day. So he didn't see the college system as being a minor league system for the pros, and they were they were barely alive. They couldn't have a minor league system like baseball did. So that's what he saw as a threat between the two. And Zupke actually helps to negotiate this thing called the Red Grange rule, which still exists today, which basically says if you start playing a college season, you cannot become a pro in that same season. It has to swing back around again. So, but without that rule in place at the time, the two could not really coexist. So it was actually the Red Grange rule that made everybody calm down for a second and say, hey, wait a second, college can be what it is, and pro can be what it is. And of course, now the elite colleges use the pro game, right, as a way to lure players and as a way to play your heart out so you can be drafted properly. So they do have, well, and then we'll see what happens in a second with private equity coming in possibly to, and all those other types of things. But it was the without the Red Grange rule in place, that's what Zupke and the others were so concerned about.
I mean, in a sense, when you were writing his character, it almost felt like he was the manifestation of the idea, the old school idea of amateurism and
Yes.
preserving amateurism, preserving college tradition. And as we've seen, like in the footnotes of your book, you do mention how, the chronological event of things that have led to the NIL movement and, players being paid. Do you think people who think like Zupke, the whole amateurism idea, is that kind of now become a relic of the past, and have more and more coaches kind of accepted the realities that these are basically professional athletes at this point?
So it's a great question. That's a great question, and I think it would be a really interesting question of a softball coach, right, today, or a swimming coach, or something that's not as televised. But I think today coaches in the college coaches have elite college coaches have two choices: embrace this, embrace it, retire and become an announcer, like someone from Alabama just did when he said, I just can't play, I just can't coach in the semi-pros," is what he called college, or go pro. So you just don't really have a choice anymore. I guess you can beat your chest about amateurism and go coach D3, or something like that. But I think the ship has sailed, and I think as Americans we like the sport too much. If we didn't, it wouldn't be driving such astronomical revenues. And I'm going to go see my kid at Notre Dame this weekend, and it's my pleasure to do that. I'm going to be paying a lot more for my tickets this weekend against Stanford, right, than has ever happened before, right, in the history of the world. So I think the ship has sailed on that.
Yeah, I agree, and it seems like things have kind of been accelerated, especially I would say in the last decade. There was so much of this whole we gotta preserve, and then after a while, it was just like you saw it coming. And
Yeah.
I've always often argued that college football is our second favorite sport in this country after the NFL.
Yeah.
While many was kind of group them together, I kind of think it's a separate thing,
Yeah,
and
but
in that
Omar,
it's
that
a
was kind of my
distant.
point. I totally agree with you, but that was kind of my
Yeah.
point. Like 100 years ago, it was on the verge of teetering, right? And so that's kind of the fun part about this book is like almost nothing's new. Like Caitlin Clark
Right.
isn't new, right? That was Red Grange, and I think the Michael Jordan analogy is a bad one because what about Magic and Larry Bird? Like they, like that's kind of silly to say like he was the first one there. By the way, Michael Jordan, remember when he starred in Space Jam in that movie? Red Grange actually acted in movies in the
Yes.
20s. Further showing that I really do think Red is the original, the original superstar. There's arguments for Babe Ruth, of course, but I really think Red is the blueprint for today.
Real quick, I do want to double back onto Red's kind of
Yeah,
celebrity, but
yeah,
closing the loop on Zupke,
yeah,
obviously he had a lot of innovations in the game, and he introduced a lot of concepts that became a part of football in general. But obviously, I think when you think of the great coaches of the past, a lot of people don't go back that far.
yeah.
They kind of stop at Bear Bryant, I would say,
Yeah, I think
in the
that's right.
college
Maybe
game.
maybe Rockney for the Newt
Yeah,
Rockney
for Notre Dame. Yeah.
for the Notre Dame fans. But I agree that he's overlooked. Let's talk about him for a second. So at that time, the way that offenses and defenses worked across the country was you find the biggest farm kid that you can possibly find, and you run the ball up the middle. And that's it. And that is
Yeah.
the game. That is the game. And then Bob Zupke comes on, this little German. Not only is he German, which is kind of fun, and he's got the German accent at the time. He's very small, too small to have ever played any sport
Yeah.
of seriousness. And so he, like many other small people and smart people, like genius that he is, uses his brain. And other coaches, in a derogatory way, start calling him Mr. Razzle Dazzle. Mr. Razzle Dazzle, because he invents the following. He invents the screen pass that never existed, the spiral snap, like basically the shotgun, flea flickers. I pass it to you, I toss it to you, you toss it back to me, I throw it to somebody else, the fake punt, right? So it was not uncommon for Zupke to punt on first down and then do it again and then fake it. So no one knew what was happening with this guy. And then best of all, he invented the huddle. There was no huddle before him because there was no need. Just give it to the biggest guy and he runs down the middle, right? So now they're actually calling a little timeout using their allotted time and saying, hey, what play are we going to run? And then I think the best part of Zupke by far is coaches were not allowed to call plays at the time. They weren't even allowed to stand up at the time. They had to sit on the bench. So the real genius of him is he would take a captain like Red Grange and teach him the game so that Red became the assistant coach, right? The offensive coordinator on the field. And that's a genius to me. Like, it's one thing to like call the plays, but it's another thing to teach young men how to do it. And I just do not think he gets enough credit for what he
In
did.
a weird way, it almost feels like he's kind of like I'm a basketball guy, so I keep on bringing
Yeah,
up the
sure,
NBA,
sure.
but how a lot of these coaches who never played kind of employing these mathematics models, and which has led to the rise of 3-point shooting, which
Yeah.
has increased efficiency and all that, and it feels like they're cut from the same cloth. What Zupke was doing and what these guys are doing, and it kind of shows the cyclical nature of it all, right? Where
Yeah. Yeah.
it's we're
Except
talking
for
about a
one-
guy that was doing this thing 100 years ago.
Yeah, except for one tiny thing. Why is Illinois football not what Notre Dame is, and Michigan and Ohio State? It's because he won 4 national championships during this period of time around Red, but in the 30s he didn't adapt. So he didn't adapt. The others adapted with razzle dazzle option offenses, but he didn't adapt in another way. He refused to recruit. He refused to have any booster money. He refused to do anything like that because he felt if you were an athlete and you lived in Illinois, you should go to your state school. End of story. He did not understand why an Illinois athlete would go to Notre Dame, that's in Indiana, or go to Ohio State, or go to Michigan. He just couldn't get his head around it, and Illinois greatly declined in the 30s, and it just significantly hurt his reputation over time by not conforming. So that's an irony. That's an irony of this. He didn't conform to the business side of this.
You innovate until you're out innovated, I guess.
That's
is the best way to put it.
That's right.
Which we see in like big tech all the time, right?
All the time. Yeah, markets get he disrupted a market, and then he got disrupted. Yeah.
Right. And in the sports fade in college football, it feels not too dissimilar from what Dabo Swinney's going through at Clemson, where he hasn't really utilized the transfer portal. He hasn't really gotten super into that, and other schools have lapped them. And that seems to be the thing. You were the disruptor, now you are the disrupted. So just kind of the nature of things, it seems, in college sports.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Yeah, now going to back to Red, something I noticed a lot was he seemed almost embarrassed by fame. Like he's just like, man, I'm just a team guy. I just want to go away and not be heard of, which is also ironic because he was mentioned he was in movies, so
right.
Not exactly the shying away from the spotlight.
Although they didn't have dialogue then, it was silent film, so he didn't have to do very much. But yes, you're right.
It felt like it worked. It worked for him, for what he was trying to do. So in many ways, he was, we have already said, an innovator in that way, where an athlete kind of branching out into other things. I mean, do you think that he was kind of the foundation layer for the concept of the athlete mogul, what a LeBron James has become, what Patrick Mahomes is with all the commercials and stuff?
Yeah, I do. And he had this agent, right? This agent in his ear too, this partner. But what they concocted, something that's, I think, a little bit different than LeBron. And LeBron, spends millions a year on his body, correct? Everything from supplements to working out to everything. So that didn't exist back then. And we're talking football. So Red and his agent knew that Red's longevity in that sport was going to be challenged from the beginning. And that's why they said, they went to the Bears and they said, we want half the gate. And then they went to the Bears and said, we want ownership in the team because that's going to last longer than Red. And they said no. So then they started their own team, the New York Yankees football team. And then the Giants said, well, hey, you can't have two teams in New York. I have the rights. So then CC Pyle said, you know what? A team's not enough. They started a league, the AFL. So their design all along was Red sails off into the sunset and continues to have this residual of not just owning a team, but owning the entire league. So that was their business strategy, if that makes sense. And it's because they were in a sport where, and you have to read the book to see what happens to Red, but in a sport where a terrible injury is always just a play away for those guys.
I mean, do you think that's too dissimilar from what somebody like LeVar Ball was trying to accomplish with his children, looking for team equity and all that stuff?
Yeah, correct. And I think those folks have really good advisors around them and are really thoughtful in terms of just how long can you be an elite athlete and what happens after that. And of course, we've all learned a lot from the 80s when these athletes just burned through their money, for example, right? So we've learned from that, and now we're watching some of these athletes become moguls. So we're learning from that too. So it's really fascinating when you can put it all together. But at the end of the day, strategy or not, you got to be really good.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got to be really, really good for this to work.
Another thing that I kind of noticed was that Red kind of was facing all these pressures across the board, right? Like, obviously at Illinois, there's a pressure to win, and then there was, the pressures from his agent, and then the pressure to join the NFL or not join the NFL, the pressure to be an ambassador for the college game, and
not to mention girlfriends, brothers, fathers,
so much
family, yeah.
And the more I think about it, it feels, well, that's pretty much what it is now still. right?
Yeah.
Like there's gonna, especially when you talk about underprivileged people who come up from, poverty and stuff like that, and they're kind of they feel this pressure to provide and all that. Is there like any lessons to be learned from what Grange did for the modern day athlete, who was at a Division I school and trying to provide for his
Yeah, well,
his or her family?
he showed, he was the pioneer. He showed them the blueprint for all the examples, the successful examples that you're talking about today, because they weren't there for him before that. If you were really good at baseball, it's unlikely you played college baseball. You went right into it, for example. So this was a new world for him to pioneer. But as you know, there's a scene in the book where we use the analogy of the sword and the stone from the Camelot story, and Red says, it's just assumed that everyone wants to be the one to pull Excalibur out, pull the sword out, like everybody wants to be the king, and he just sort of calls it time out for a second and says, why does everybody want to be the king? And that with that comes a tremendous amount of pressure. And I was thinking about that too, like, oh my gosh, my whole life I wanted to draw the sword and be the king, and I never thought twice about what that would actually do. And you know what he's most proud of? What Red is most proud of when you look back at his life? He lived to be like 90, and he played, and then he was one of the first color commentators on television too, right? He had this long career. His favorite part was about 10 years after he quit playing, before television started, where he owned an insurance company. And what did he like about it? This is going to blow everybody's mind. He liked going to work. He liked going to work and doing a good job and going home and providing for his family. And it's just like all he ever wanted. And I think it is really interesting, because I think today we've seen Red be successful and Michael Jordan be successful and everybody else be successful, but he hadn't before that, and he never saw that as fun. Never saw it as fun.
I see that as the great paradox of football, I think, where it's a sport that kind of generates a lot of revenue now, of course. I mean, even back then at the college level it did. And you have like these guys who are like, it's team first, team concept, putting in work and doing all this, and it's a very workmanlike sport in that way, and most positions, especially like on the interior lines, will kind of feel that way, and yet it's a sport that is now millions of dollars are attached to player contracts, and it's almost like a little paradoxical where these players are workmanlike, but also there's the celebrity that comes with it too, because you're on TV every Sunday or every Saturday on the college level. It's just, I find it very interesting.
Yeah, although I do find it interesting, and I do believe Red to be humble and all the things that we talked about. There was one tiny little thing though. If you become the type of person in football who's a big show off, and your team is not on your side, they will just step aside and let you get creamed and not block for you, right? So there is also a strategy of building up the guys around you too, which I think he believed, but it worked really well for him. And I should have looked it up, but in at Notre Dame, when they had the four horsemen, which are the four folks in the backfield, and they got all the acclaim, that we need to look it up. There was the other guys in the team like called themselves like the 11 minus 4, the 7 mules. I think they're like if they're the horsemen, what are we? Basically,
right?
So I think that was an element. By the way, the 4 horsemen, only 3 were all Americans. Why wasn't the 4th? Because Red Grange played that year and took his spot. So.
Took away the clean sweep for Notre Dame.
That's right.
Something that the fans will remember for many years, I would imagine.
That's right.
It's funny you mentioned they won't block for your thing, and when you said that, I immediately thought of the movie Any Given Sunday, where Jamie Foxx gets obliterated because his ego had gotten a little bit too large, and that's very true.
And when Red went pro, they did it to him several times. Mm-hmm. Several times. It wasn't necessarily he did anything wrong. They're just like, listen, really, you're going to make more than Babe Ruth this one game? Well, have fun with this, right? So, just jealous too.
Speaks to like the craziness of public-facing contracts when it comes to players. It's like, you make a bad throw. Well, what are we paying you $45 million for? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
And back then, especially when the salaries weren't super high. At least now we could say, well, everybody's a millionaire in the NFL,
Yeah.
and even now it's a little bit different. But back then, I could only imagine it was the jealousy was just
Yeah, I mean,
ramped
they're
up
making
because
$50, and people might make $2,000 a year. That's the average salary, $2,000 a year. Red Grange might make $50,000 a game, right? So it's just astronomical. By the way, he didn't make that. Back to our sports agent, right? What do agents make today, or what do we assume they make today? 10%, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. See, the original contract was 60% CC Pyle, 40% Red.
That's crazy.
And at the last minute, Red's like, no, that's not fair. So they made it 50-50. So this agent wasn't even a 10% agent. He was a flat out business partner in this thing. So fascinating times.
I mean, think about Pyle. Just as someone who's read the book, it's kind of like he almost reads like the villain at times. And was that kind of intentional?
Yeah, well, I think history has vilified him like that. I think you personified him as greed, if you will. And I think I tried to write it in such a way that you could make your choice. I think most people will choose to see him as a villain. But what's actually fun as an author with a villain is you try to have empathy for the villain and put yourself in his shoes. And from his standpoint, it's not about 50% or anything like that. He's helping this kid Red, who would have got screwed over making $500 a game, and all the other hot shots would have taken all his money. So in his mind, how I said he split it with the Bears. He split. He also split it with Red, because he's saying, without me, you wouldn't have been able to pull this off. So it's just kind of fun, I think, to look at villains from both lenses a little bit, and then you decide who's who.
Yeah, that first initial reaction was like, "Whoa, screw this guy," But then you kind of think about it, and then you're just like, considering what he would have been paid, and the impact, and it goes back to the earlier thing where I feel like we're almost preconditioned to hate the agent, hate the athlete, but in realistic perspective, there wasn't really the infrastructure that is now in terms of the way contracts are supposed to work and all that. And he just wanted his fair share for driving attendance into these games for a league that was quite frankly struggling, to gain.
Yeah, and by the way, in the first Hall of Fame class, first NFL Hall of Fame class, they took 17 people. Red is in there, the owner of the Bears is in there, owner of the Giants is in there, some commissioners and such, and a player like Jim Thorpe. But Red's not actually in that class for being a NFL athlete. He's in it for putting the game on the map. I mean, they flat say that. I mean, he was a great athlete, don't get me wrong. He's a much better college athlete than pro athlete because he sustained an injury. But this is the NFL saying, thank you, Red. Thank you very much. And I think at some point there's other league owners in the WNBA are going to say, if they're not already, or say the same thing. Thank you, Caitlin.
Yeah.
Thank
Absolutely.
you. And of course, Caitlin's stuck by the max of rookie contracts, and things like that. So we'll see what happens with her in a little bit here too.
Yeah, and I think they have, they just kind of re-up their collective bargaining agreement, so she'll get paid. I mean, she's already probably getting a bunch of money from her shoe deal with Nike and all that, so that helps. But yeah, considering where the league is going, you would hope that she's
what
compensated for it.
might even be a better analogy is Messi. Because he's not only playing in the MLS, he basically owns the team and gets a whole cut of the television broadcast across the whole thing. So maybe he's kind of like a Messi meets Caitlin. Red Grange was like a Messi meets Caitlin Clark, if you will.
Yeah, that's a really good point, which I thought that was genius maneuvering by Messi. He could have taken a lot of money to play in Saudi Arabia like Cristiano Ronaldo did. Instead, he comes to the MLS, he gets all these residuals, and it's just worked out really well for him.
And I mean, nothing against other countries, but I think he picked a pretty nice place to raise his family too.
Not bad
In the U.S. and
in
Miami. So yeah, I think he had a lot of wins there. Yeah.
Yeah, he did. He did well for himself, as he has done it throughout his
Not,
entire
not to
career.
mention, although he is the great, but he's also scoring goals at will in
Yeah,
this league too. So and that's always fun to score a goal. Even when I play with my kids and I accidentally score a goal, it feels good. So it's fun.
to close out, one last thing about Red here is, would you say he's kind of the most important figure of the early NFL in the sense, you have some characters in your book, George Halas, owner of the Bears, Wellington Mara, owner of the Giants, who even average football fans have heard of at least. Halas is kind of deified in certain regards, especially in the Midwest. But
Yeah.
would you say he's, if not the most important figure, one of the most important figure to establishing what the NFL has become, 100 years later?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. What'll happen though is people will say, well, that like Jim Thorpe was earlier and better, and all these different types of things. But and I don't want to get religious on your podcast, but there's like a lot of different prophets, and then depending on your religion, one came along that was a little bit different than the other ones, right? No matter which, we could be talking about multiple religions when I say that, but I do think he deserves that. He was not the first good player, but what he did for the game is the blueprint today. Is the blueprint today. And without him, I think they would have gone bankrupt, and I think somebody would have got it up and going again once television got started. But they were teetering. I think the depression. They often say the depression would have wiped it right out. Were it not like a celebrity of Red, it made him feel good during the depression. So yes, I think he's. I mean, I wrote the book, I guess, but I think he's everything.
Yeah, and the depression aspect is, I think, a really big one because he played his entire career through the depression. Like he enters the league in the late 20s, right before the crash.
Yeah,
And
yeah. That's right.
and then
Most of he got famous in the Roaring '20s. Yes, and then he sustained through the depression. True. Yep.
yeah, and so it gave something for people to want to go out and see, right? Where maybe they weren't trying to do that too much, cutting back, and with job loss and famine, and especially like during the Dust Bowl era and all that stuff. And I think it's not too much of a stretch to say if he wasn't there that we don't have the NFL that in the capacity that we have it today. And maybe it changes with the onset of TV, like you mentioned in the '60s. But I think that I think he's more of a seminal figure than most football fans give him credit to.
Yeah.
Give credit to him. I know I didn't really know the story. I've heard the name, of course, and and when I read the book, I was like, wow, the parallels are just really insane.
Yeah, and a story about a guy a long time ago who scored a lot of touchdowns. That's okay. That's okay. But we're talking about setting the blueprint for modern football, and I think that's why it's worthy of a book. And worthy of attention. I'm glad that you listened to the audio version of it. I'm very proud of the actor that does that. He does different voices and such. And you might have enjoyed that one chapter. It comes out of nowhere with the radio, the old time radio
Yes.
show in it. So yeah, they did a really good job with that version of it.
Look, as someone who's consumed a lot of audiobooks, Doug, you could kind of identify when it's well done and considered, and when it was just like whatever, slap it on and hope for the best. Like one that comes to mind is I read a lot of Jeff Pearlman's books, again, sports
Yeah.
author, and he had a book about the Dallas Cowboys in the '90s, and like this voice actor that they hired, he couldn't even pronounce some of these teams' names right, and I'm just like, people like, come on, let's put a little.
Yeah,
bit
I'm
of
very
effort.
proud of Jack who did this one, and I took the time. It's all Jack, but I took the time to listen to them, and
Yeah.
and suggest edits here and there because I care about you and people that are reading it. Anyway, thank you for consuming it like that. It's a fun way to do
Yeah.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Well, Doug, man, I appreciate you taking the time to really talk about this. I really enjoyed your book. It's called The Golden Age of Red, available on Amazon, Audible, wherever you buy books, local bookstores, all that. I know you have a website where people could check out all of your other work and all that.
Yep. It's just my name,
provide that?
DougVillhard.com. Yep, and you'll see a pattern of me writing about entrepreneurial minds like CC Pyle who are kind of ahead of their time. I'm really a sucker for those kind of people.
Listen, I find them fascinating as well. So make sure to check out Doug's website. It'll be linked in the show notes. Thank you for tuning in for another episode of the Deep Cover Podcast. Make sure you subscribe and follow the pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Doug, thanks again. And until next time, everybody, we'll see you next week on the Deep Cover Podcast.